Welcome back to Gamelog. In this episode, we will be moving through our first iteration of the build, measure, learn feedback loop in order to arrive at our first minimum viable product. So this is an animation I've created to help us illustrate and understand our first iteration through the build, measure, learn feedback loop. We're going to be going over this at a high level now and diving deeper throughout the video. So we start with an idea. We take this idea, move into the build phase, and arrive at our minimum viable product. Next, we want to measure how well our minimum viable product is performing. We'll then enter the measure phase and use metrics to understand our user engagement and retention. The data output from our measure phase will help to inform our learn phase, and we'll use validated learning to help understand whether our product is a hit or a miss. This learn phase may inspire new ideas or product features, which we'll be introducing through further iterations and cycles through this feedback loop. And we'll eventually come to a point where we need to make a decision whether to pivot away from this game idea or to persevere, depending on how the engagement and retention metrics are performing. But it all starts with our game idea. Pretty proud I made that animation myself. So this is the game idea that I've come up with to use as a practical example within this video series. I've called it MathGrid. That's just a placeholder. We can rename this. I'm going to walk through these mockups at a very high level, and then we'll dive a bit deeper throughout this video. So we're looking at three screens here. On the far left, we have a type of homepage or a landing page where we have a few options. So you open up the game and you can either play, which will take you to the second screen, or how to play. I didn't mock up the how to play screen because a proficient developer should be able to create the screen without any reference really, especially for a minimum viable product. We could have created it, but we're not going for perfection here within our first revision of this game. So minimum viable product first. The screen in the middle is really the core of the game. It's what we might call a gameplay state or a gameplay screen. There's a few elements here that we're going to be diving into within the next few minutes. And then finally, we have a game over screen. So, showing the player's final score, the ability to play again, or go back to the home screen. Minimum viable product, very unambitious. We just want to finish the game. We want to get published, and we want to be able to measure player engagement and retention. That's more important than creating the next biggest game right off the bat. So I've written up a few light requirements here we'll just go through to help understand. The player objective is to achieve the highest possible score before the timer runs out. Pretty exciting, I know. The timer will count down from 60 seconds. We'll provide a randomly generated multiplication equation. I just want to point out it will be multiplication only. We're not going to focus on many different types of operations. The max operand value is 12, so either a number on the side of the equation will only be a maximum of 12. We'll have a randomly generated answer grid of possibilities below the equation, where only one tile is the correct answer. And within future iterations of this game, as we tune it and make it more exciting for our players, there's going to be many customizations and improvements that we can make. We can create a score multiplier for consecutive correct answers, meaning that if I get 2 answers in a row correct, it's multiplied by 2, or 5 answers in a row correct, that particular score is multiplied by 5, and so on. We can add different timer options, so maybe allowing the player to play for 5 minutes, maybe an endurance mode for an hour, or even allow custom timing. We can add new equation types such as addition or division, or even algebraic equations. To make the game more exciting, we could add sound effects and music. Something we could add to this game, taking it to the next level, would be animations, and there's really no limit on our creativity there. We could allow for color customizations, allowing the player to choose instead of this green here we see, but allowing them to pick their favorite color for the game. And our last improvement idea is the ability to share score on social networks. So we've taken a moment to review our build phase, which will end with our minimum viable product. Now we want to understand how we'll be measuring that player engagement and retention. When we speak about measurement in the context of lean startup, we're really speaking mostly about what's called innovation accounting, and we'll define our 3 learning milestones. The first learning milestone of innovation accounting is to establish the baseline. Our baseline measurement will be made up of the first metrics that we capture from our initial release of our minimum viable product. Once we've taken this first baseline measurement, we can tune the engine, meaning that we'll make optimizations to our product to help improve those user engagement and retention metrics. And finally, at the end of every iteration of the build, measure, learn feedback loop, we'll come to a decision point where we want to either pivot away from our current product idea or to persevere and keep iterating through the loop, tuning the engine, making it better. Before we begin to measure our minimum viable product or any other iteration of the product afterwards, we need to understand vanity metrics and actionable metrics. Vanity metrics are superficial, poorly understood metrics that often don't translate into meaningful business results. So let's look at a few examples to help understand what this actually means. The first example is total number of games played by all users. If we assume that we have 1 million total games played by all users, that sounds like a lot. But what if the vast majority of those games played are by a single user? That would be an example of a vanity metric because, yes, we have a lot of games played by all users, but there's really only one person enjoying our game, which is not effective at all. The next example here is number of downloads. So if we assume we have 1 million players download our game, what if they all played the game once and hated it? It wouldn't matter if we had 10 million downloads. Maybe all of those downloads were driven by advertisement and everyone downloaded it and just didn't enjoy the game at all. Not very effective. And I threw in another example, so maybe we capture number of reviews and we're really proud of our 1 million reviews. Well, what if they're all 1-star reviews? Or maybe they're mixed reviews, and is anyone commenting or leaving feedback? The quality of the review matters as well. So we'll contrast this with actionable metrics, which is really what we want to be measuring. Clearly defined measurements that deliver valuable insights related to business objectives. So let's look at a few examples. The number of games played in a single session per user. If I define a session as just sitting down for the next period of time without closing the app, how many games did that user play on average? Really, with the actual metrics, we want to look at per user engagement, right? So for this example, did the player play once per session? That wouldn't be very impressive. But what if on average our users played 10 games per session? That would be a much more effective measurement of engagement and retention. The number of minutes played per user per day. Again, we're trying to understand on average what each user is doing, the per user interaction within our game or application. So if the average minutes played per user per day is 1 minute, then they only played once. But if it's, on average across all users 30 minutes, that would be excellent. And I really like this last example, the consecutive days played per user. This gives us an idea of a retention rate on average across all users of the game or application. Engagement and retention are our goal here with our measurements. In order to measure this, we're going to need to set up game analytics, which actually isn't part of the minimum viable product and will likely be a second iteration of the build, measure, learn feedback loop. So I've actually never published an app on an app store such as the Apple App Store or Google Play Store. So I don't exactly know how these analytics platforms work. I've taken the time to compile a list of potential sources of game analytics we'll be able to use to measure our player engagement and retention. So I'm confident within the app stores themselves, whether it's the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, that we'll be able to find some type of app analytics. I've looked around and there's also some platform-specific services such as Google Play Game Services or Apple Game Center, but I'm not certain if these even provide analytics capabilities. I've also put down Google Analytics, which is really great for web analytics, but I'm not sure if you can integrate it within, say, a Flutter app being published into an app store. There are some really great analytics as a service products on the market, particularly GameAnalytics.com looked very promising, but there's a lot of documentation to get through, so maybe not, we'll see. And I would love to use Azure PlayFab. It looks like a really solid platform. However, the Flutter integration available was an open source project. It looked like it was developed by someone who's not even affiliated with PlayFab. And the project hasn't been updated in 3 years. So I'm fairly certain we won't be using Azure PlayFab for our analytics, but Microsoft, please. Flutter is like the future of mobile development. You should really create some strong integrations within the platform. And we also have the ability to create a custom analytics engine. Firebase is a cloud backend that is commonly used by Flutter developers to create all sorts of things. You could use it to create custom analytics, which would be quite a bit of effort. Although when I went back to the Firebase website, it did look like it had some analytics capabilities out of the box, which is outstanding. All right, so we've reviewed our build phase, our measure phase. Now we're thinking about the data that's output for measure. How do we learn from that data? Well, it's going to be tough because within this first iteration, we're not even really going to have our whole analytics pipeline set up. So there's some things we're going to want to learn within our first iteration instead of our user engagement and retention. So what are we learning within this first iteration? Number 1, how to build a minimum viable product. We need to start somewhere, and this is where it all begins. Number 2, how to finish a game using Flutter. I've created so many small game and interaction demos, and I'm really looking forward to finally finishing a game and getting it published. Which brings us to number 3, how to publish an app, both in the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. There are going to be differences. Apple actually has an app approval process that you need to go through before you can even get your game or app within their App Store. So that should be quite interesting to go through. And finally, our last learning goal for our first iteration through the build, measure, learn feedback loop is to learn how to measure player engagement, feedback, and retention within a Flutter application, published to one of these digital app stores. In the next episode of Gamelog, we will be building our first minimum viable product using the Flutter open source framework. The outcome of this will be our first finished mobile game. We'll see you in the next episode.